so den rechten Seite sowie den Außenbereich. Teil an der Nordseite sowie den Außenbereich
Moving forward.
That was a very insightful session, so I suppose that a lot of you have comments, maybe to extend the debate or because they are surprised. I was quite surprised when I heard you, Rodolphe Daudier. I was surprised to understand that the main difference in lifestyles is not distance related, the distance from the central city, but it's mostly related to the size of the town where you live. Yes, the town where you live. That seemed counterintuitive, but unlike you, I'm not a specialist of the topic. I would like to echo one of the things that were said or maybe disagree. Here I'm mostly thinking about people coming from abroad, from Belgium or Germany, the US, Canada, Senegal, Canada, Zimbabwe. We've heard a lot about Switzerland or Germany this morning, but maybe there are different territories that you'd like to speak about to shed a different light, or maybe any comment. Michel, bear in mind that there are tweeters that wanted to speak up. Le Peri-urban, once again, that's someone who really follows us intently. The issue of women in the peri-urban becoming rooted in your local area. Is it turning your back on your personal ambition? That's for you, Martine Anger. Well, based on the examples of the Western Paris region, I would answer no. The women that we met in the interviews, as well as statistical analyses, show that very often women, these are highly skilled women that we're talking about, who are seeking local jobs. Of course, they don't do that right off the bat, but they do that after 2 or 5 years. Another thing that you can say is it depends where they live in the peri-urban. It's true that a survey that we conducted 20 years ago showed that people living near Saint-Quentin-en-Yvelines, a big conurbation, could more easily relocate nearby. So I think, and here I agree with other presentations, you shouldn't ignore the way people become rooted in an area, the way cities are connected, the jobs that are in a given town. The peri-urban is not just people becoming settled down in uniform developments in the same way everywhere. Although people buy from the same developers, they won't have the same opportunities. And I don't think at all that they're turning their backs on anything. Yet, this calls for a qualification. Sandrine Nalinsky showed that settling down in the peri-urban may mean that you may have access to a lesser variety or quantity of jobs, so you are more vulnerable to unemployment. That's a reality. Madam, I'm Joël Tournebise from SNCF. I wanted to talk about captives. Captive women. Eric Le Breton has highlighted a phenomenon of women who have very low mobility, mostly of immigrant origins, who are very mobile because every year they go back to their country of origin. And as part of your captive women, have you identified that type of profile? Rodolphe Daudier, yes, I'll answer. In Western France, in the peri-urban, you don't have that many foreign women. It's a very white, homogeneous peri-urban area. You don't find that type of profiles. But here you can connect that to the previous question, the way women experience their arrival into the peri-urban. That's very diverse. It all depends on their professional and family background, and sometimes they turn their backs on something, their professional life, very often, to better live with their family. It's a matter of, it's always the same with domination. You have to accept it. So the way women express it, they use very positive terms. I'm not always running. My life has improved, but still, you can see backgrounds where women go from intermediate executives to municipal employees with only part-time jobs, but they don't necessarily see that as something very negative on the personal front. Jean-Pierre Rebel, did you want to add something? No. Sir, I come from a British town called Bordeaux. Well, that's your own view then. During lunch, I made a test showing that it's very difficult to use references from the past century, so I always play a role as an archivist. Where do you work? I work at the Bordeaux Urban Planning Agency, but I used to be a researcher for a very long time. So here I'm speaking as a researcher. It's a reading note from a book that shows that the peri-urban are happy to have turned their back on the city and live in new villages. This survey shows that urban forms can be used differently and sometimes in contradictory manners by different populations. The petits bourgeois still live only in their homes, not talking to their neighbors and shopping at the supermarket, whereas executives with new ideologies create societies, attend celebrations and buy their eggs at the local farm. This is a reading note by Henri Mandras, a major French sociologist, written on a book written in 1978 by Jean-Michel Roux, Urbanization in a Scattered City, 1978, ladies and gentlemen. Jean-Michel Roux very often says it's difficult to be right too early. But then at the same time, there was the Mayou report that came out, a finance inspector, who said that in the future, it was published by La Documentation Française. It was a book with a wide circulation that was talked about in all urban planning journals, and the Mayou report said that the peri-urban is nothing to be ashamed of. These are strategic areas. We don't really know whether it's good or bad in terms of transport and energy, but anyway, it does exist, so you have to take account of it, and there's a diversity of peri-urban practices. Everything was already said. It was already there 35 years ago. Everything was there about the diversity of the peri-urban, so the stereotypes that are under fire right now were already discussed, and everything has already been said about the fact that the peri-urban had to be based on projects because that's where everything that's interesting is going on. So you need to change your glasses, but the interesting question is, why does it take so long for us to change our glasses on a number of issues, but maybe more specifically on that issue? That's the end for me as an archivist. Well, if everything has already been said, maybe we can go off for a coffee. No, that's the question. The question is, why do we have to say the same things again and again? Things have probably changed a bit. It's probably interesting to see what has changed. And I think here you can look at the location of researchers, for instance. The fact that there are fewer and fewer resources in research shows that there's a cultural reassessment of the peri-urban. But that's the big issue. This change of glasses, why is it so difficult for it to happen? I hope that we won't meet again in 30 years to say that the peri-urban is very good, there's a lot of diversity, and we need to say something, to do something about it. Well, Jean-Michel Roux was one of the precursors with his book in 1976. Well, I'm here as a living fossil, but I can't add anything to what's already been said. Of course, it's very strange that in 40 years, that it took 40 years more or less to reach the point where we are right now in terms of observation. And we're still far from taking action, having decent and skilled territorial development of these urban areas. These are urban areas. I mean, stop talking about the peri-urban. We all live in towns. We are all urbanites in a way because there's nothing beyond that. The rural has disappeared. The rural as the fertile ground for a peasant society that Henri Magras was talking about has disappeared. This is specific to France, so that we still talk about the peri-urban. Over 40 years, I've mostly seen people putting the blame on the peri-urban, which was seen as the bad student in the class, and it's been going on for 40 years. And maybe it would be important to talk about the previous forms of urbanization before there was the rise of the single-family home in the 1970s. Before that, everything was regimented, and the people who had that imposed on them rejected it, and they ran away, and they showed some insubordination here. They showed dissent. And, well, we are still doing away with that way of thinking, but we still don't have the modes of territorial development that we deserve. There's no single operator to conduct good territorial development in the peri-urban, and as soon as you have projects outside the boundaries of historical towns or cities, they are immediately contaminated by densification projects which are not adapted to these new forms of urbanization. And the same applies to all urban projects. That's true for transport. And you also need to reform local authorities. That's something that has started everywhere in France, everywhere except in France. Well, in Switzerland there are the cantons, but in France we've had the same municipal organization since the French Revolution. So there are a few trains that we missed. And you just need to go to another country to realize that. And so developers and local representatives, that's a question for you. Well, there are no developers in urban areas. You talk about housing lots, but that's about 20% of real estate development, and there are no real developers to speak of because they're not that involved. There are a lot of leakages in the peri-urban phenomenon. You can also look at the land economy. We're not talking about that today, but it would deserve a close look, because if you want to take action, you need to know what the costs are. Is there someone in the room who could talk from the viewpoint of developers or architects?
You need a microphone. Thomas Everts.
Thank you very much for this very good research, your very good summary. This was really great. And what strikes me most is the variety of your findings. There's no one majority stream, you can say. There's no one trend. There are perhaps 3 to 4 more or less equal trends which contradict each other. And what you said about personalities, yet you say that somebody can come to these peri-urban villages and can become burgomaster, mayor in no time. I think this is another interesting finding. The variety of things shows how much would be possible in these areas of different developments. And the role of the personality could show how important, what chances there would be personalities if they really take the chances of the peri-urban area to develop something specific. We have a few communes in Germany which have an enormous degree of freedom, much more than in France, who develop a completely autochthone energy system. They're completely independent of the general nets, things of this kind, or different kinds of schools. Or if they are distant, They develop different kinds of children's care to keep people in the area. So to offer something special which you wouldn't get in the city. And I think in France, the possibilities, the opportunities, the chances are enormous if I look here to your analysis of the actual situation.
You wanted to respond to just said, yes, I would like to respond, but also in connection with what was said earlier, and that's more or less the same question. The one difference in peri-urban areas is that we find that the body politic has changed. I mean, now the political landscape is scattered. You have all sorts of small towns with local authorities, etc. But you may remember that mayors in the 70s and 1980s, they were hoping to have as many inhabitants as possible, and they were not too much concerned about public services being provided. Whereas now, the peri-urban sphere has become more mature. So there's an effort to control the extent of urbanization, and that's indeed why we are even discussing this today. We are looking about public services, whether they can be extended all over the territory, if they can be restructured around certain major axes or what. And if you look at municipal elections with the elections of mayors and their social background, we can see that clearly we're looking at a grassroots effort, a bottom-up approach. It's not as though everything is dictated from the top in a sort of a centralized structure. But of course, when you have a situation of he who owns the land plays or calls the tunes, as it were, well, of course, inevitably you'll have forms of fast urbanization. But still, I think there's new awareness entering the body politic. If I may, if you look at property developers, especially in the Paris area, you have more and more dialogue between the various government agencies, these urban planning agencies and the property developers. There's an effort to try and coordinate policies. So if you want to build an area, you have to serve an area in terms of services. As you have land that is used for agricultural purposes, how can that be kept alive? And on the political side, looking at urban planning, you have just an overall system, but then you have also local points of service, and so that may apply to daycare centers, this may apply to social housing, etc. So there's a grand plan rather, and then local scale efforts, if only to keep the local shops alive. Sir, from the Denmark. Well, you asked to have the view of people from the outside. So I live in Denmark, so I can give you a view from the outside. But one thing is for sure, Denmark is a very egalitarian country, and this is also a comment I would like to make. All the people I know in the part of the country where I live, people have always, one of the criteria has always been how accessible is the place, how much time it takes to get there. And so it doesn't matter whether it's a husband or the wife doing the work. It doesn't matter. So you have people living in Odense and working 10 kilometers away, but they can always cycle there. There are cycle paths all over the place. So if the husband works 10 kilometers away, the wife will do the shopping to drive 25 kilometers away to the local train station and there take a train to the center of Copenhagen. And so that's easier to do when you live that far away, rather than if you live 10 kilometers away from Copenhagen. Even though the geographical distance may be shorter, it may be easier to commute that way. and around towns where you have many businesses being set up, people need to do not like to go there by train because, of course, the highways are congested, and of course they have to get back home before 5 p.m. to collect the children before school closes. So you might be better off. You might be better off living away from the center, and so the way it's organized is you go to the local school, and then you have daycare centers that stay open longer to take that into account. So people have found a way around the transportation system. So people will be perfectly happy to live far away from the city if they live close to the sea, if they can work 3 days a week, if they can work on the train. There are parts of the train where you can work, and that you have silent cars on the trains where people are there to work. And that means that even though there may not be trail links everywhere, there may not be road links everywhere, people find that they find accessibility in that way, and the solutions may not be simply geographical. Well, you asked me to talk about Denmark. That's a Danish model, but it doesn't exist only in Denmark. Yes, going around Europe, I had a question from Claire Arago and Martine Berger. You mentioned the Paris area, but some of the trends that you have outlined in the Paris area could probably apply to other parts of the country, or is it something specific to the Paris area? Is it because the Paris area is so big? I mean, of course, it's the largest in Europe. If you include Istanbul and London, I mean, in as much as Istanbul is part of Europe, I mean, the size is so different that it simply does not compare with what you find in Belgium, Switzerland, or Germany, because you can be in a peri-urban areas, and you're in Germany, and you're no further away than 30 or 40 kilometers from a big city, whereas in France, this is geographically different. So would you find the same situation in these sort of these networked countries like Germany? And then there's another question about women working in urban lifestyle. We find that the sort of situation is very much to do with family policies. And in France and in Scandinavia, you have all sorts of child benefits that make a big difference, whereas if you go to other countries like Italy, when you simply haven't got these benefits or you have no daycare centers, well, then, of course, it means that people, and that makes it impossible for women to work. And so that explains most of the difference. Never mind how close or distance you may your work is located. If you haven't got daycare centers, you simply can't afford to work. Well, look, if you look at this second part of your question, if you compare, say, France with Germany, and say the facilities available to mothers for their young children, of course, that makes a big difference, and that will be decisive in whether a woman will work, a mother will work or not. And if you look at the number of women working, paradoxically in France, it is not within the city of Paris, but in the outer cities, in the outskirts of Paris, that you have more mothers working. And it's not the case either that in smaller towns or villages that you find working mothers, because that's where you have most of the low income or poverty stricken people. So the one decisive factor is the level of skills, the educational level, the fact that you have working couples, and it is in the higher echelons you have. That's where you have the highest number of working couples, even though if you look at working mothers, there is, of course, a shortfall in the higher executives who might well give up their jobs to look after their children. Having said that, if you compare this with Belgium or Switzerland, where you have cities much closer together, inevitably things will work differently. Probably you'll have more people, even say in a couple, you'll have one person working in one city and the other in another city because it is geographically possible. I haven't got the example of other European cities. I imagine things are very different in London, but it is also to do with the way in which the cities are laid out. There is, of course, something to do with urban design, but in the Paris area, we have reached a point of saturation. Even with a more effective transportation situation, you need to have a multi-center structure. Well, about the Paris area, you have in the first ring lots of course, higher skilled, higher echelon people, and this means not only you have people who live there with higher skills, but also services of a better quality services become available. So you have shops or specialized shops or specialized medical services that become available simply because you have a clientele that can afford these better services. But then these services become available to the local populations as well, and that is where you will find these centers of say medical excellence. You have all sorts of medical specialties that you will not find in rural peri-urbanized areas where the average income is lower. But so it means that the lower income people living in close proximity to the better off will be able to take advantage of the kind of services that become available. Well, we have a little while left for comments. I believe there's comments in the audience, but also something on the internet. No. There we are. That is again somebody in the audience. I mean, now you know who you are. So I mean, you are posting your message on the screen. What is the role of public policies, of public mobility policies in the peri-urban sphere? That, of course, is a relevant issue, but it will be addressed later on this afternoon. So, Julien de Ladaka, maybe if you allow me, I'll give the floor to the last two speakers. This lady. Yes, my name is Carole Boucher, and I will be very brief, and I would like to about this business of things that haven't changed for the past 40 years, and that this has always been a multifaceted situation. You have to recognize that for the past 40 years, there are public policies, consistent public policies against urban sprawl. And if you, in a way, want to sort of control the development of the vitality of peri-urban spaces, it means that, well, the efforts to control urban sprawl have failed. And so to get back into a virtuous cycle where a positive development of the peri-urban space can then bring about a sort of a qualitative development of peri-urban dwelling. And you, sir, what did you have to say? Well, I used to work in the local council, and I was a part of the environmental party, the Greens, and I had an argument with Cécile Duflot, who was head of our party, and I said that you had as many trains going from Paris to the outside as there were going the other way. And so our mayors tend to say, well, look, it's now we're getting people coming from Paris and who are now moving out. And I said, look, we should have what we call these basins of life, and I asked for subsidies to support these basins. She disagreed, and so I was kicked out. And she said, well, we should have a single railway pass, which would be the easy solution. But that single rate railway pass costs 2.5 billion over 5 years, and there are other solutions. You could have these express buses. You had a number of such express bus links, also night buses, night metros. Now, all the money was put into the price of the railway pass, and then the number of services has dwindled down to nothing. It's only 20 million, and if you look at the Greater Paris area, only half a billion will be dedicated to that. So all the money, I mean, because Cécile Duflot was unable to explain what a basin of life was to the general public on radio, because of that, all the money now has been invested in making the railway pass cheaper, but then the number of services has dwindled, which goes to show that if you object to Cécile Duflot, then you're shown the door. And you want to say something. I mean, you are a formal. Well, what do you have to say about these comments? Well, there are two things that come out of these comments. Number one, a politician needs to have very simple concepts, even though this translates into disastrous economic choices. And we had the example there with the single rate railway pass, which was made at the expense of actual services. So maybe we are moving away from this, but this means that for the past 40 years we've been stuck in these unfortunate policies. And I mean, it's all very well to say you need time to work things out, but maybe a bit less time would have helped. Well, thank you to all of you.
Den Rechten.